You're okay now. NGT, panting. Gasps. NGT, thank you. NGT, what is this? NGT, he had 30 seconds to decide. The water was black, the depth was unknown, and the thing screaming beneath the surface wasn't human. Most people would have walked away. Marcus Webb was not most people. Nobody told him that the choice he made in that moment on a rain-soaked maintenance platform on a planet he wasn't even supposed to be on would change the course of two civilizations. Nobody told him that pulling one small, terrified creature out of the water would put him at the center of a political firestorm that spanned 6 star systems, and absolutely nobody told him what her people would offer him as thanks, because if they had, he probably still would have jumped in. That's the kind of man Marcus Webb was, and by the time this story is over, you're going to understand exactly why the galaxy underestimated humanity for the last time. This is what happened. This is how it really went down, and I'm going to take you through every single second of it, from the moment Marcus heard that sound under the water to the moment he stood in front of the High Council of the Veil and said the 3 words that nobody in that chamber expected, 3 words that echoed across the stars. But we'll get to that. First, let's go back to the beginning. Marcus Webb was 34 years old, 61, built like someone who spent most of his career crawling through maintenance shafts and hauling equipment in low gravity. He had calloused hands, a 2-day beard that never seemed to grow past 2 days, and a reputation in the outer frontier corps for being the kind of engineer who got things done without asking too many questions. That last part was what had landed him on Varoth 4 in the first place. Varoth 4 was a Tier 2 colony world, mostly water, with a scattering of raised archipelago platforms that the early settlers had built up into a functioning port system. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't glamorous. The rain was constant, the air smelled like salt and rust, and the local wildlife had a habit of climbing onto the platform struts during high tide and screaming at you. Marcus had been there for 11 days, assigned to repair a filtration array on Platform 7's lower deck. Routine work, the kind of job that didn't make it into recruitment posters. He was 3 days from finishing when the storm hit. It wasn't supposed to be a bad one. The meteorological systems on Varoth 4 were old but functional, and the forecast had called for moderate precipitation with surface chop reaching maybe 2 m. What actually arrived was something significantly angrier, a pressure system that rolled in from the Eastern Ocean and promptly doubled in intensity over the warmer, shallow waters near the archipelago. By the time the alerts upgraded, Marcus was already outside on the lower maintenance walkway, a ratchet in his hand and safety harness clipped to the rail, watching the sky turn the color of a bruise. He should have gone inside. He knew he should have gone inside. Instead, he finished the coupling he was working on, because Marcus Webb was the kind of man who finished what he started, and that decision, that stubborn refusal to leave a job half done, put him on that walkway at exactly the right moment, or the wrong moment, depending on your perspective. He heard it before he saw it, a sound that cut through the howling wind and the rain hammering the metal grating beneath his boots. It wasn't the wildlife, it wasn't mechanical, it was high-pitched, rhythmic, and desperate in a way that bypassed every rational filter in a human brain and went straight to the part that woke up in caves 100,000 years ago and knew exactly what something in pain sounded like. Marcus was at the railing before he consciously decided to move. The water below Platform 7 was churning. The storm surge had already pushed the surface level up by nearly a meter, and the normal clear blue of Verith IV's shallows had gone dark and violet. Marcus leaned over the railing, squinting against the rain, and that's when he saw her. She was small, maybe the size of a 14-year-old human, though he had no way of knowing her actual age. She was pale. Not human pale, but the pale of something that had never been meant to be in sunlight, a kind of luminescent silver white that he could actually see. Under the churned-up water, she had 2 arms, 2 legs, a face that was close enough to human that his brain registered it as a face before it, registered it as different. Her hair, if you could call it that, was a dark violet, and it spread around her in the water like ink dropped into a glass, and she was drowning, not struggling, not swimming badly, drowning. Her arms were barely moving, her face kept slipping under and coming back up, and slipping under again, and each time it stayed under a little longer. Marcus assessed in about 2 seconds. The water was dark, the storm was getting worse. There were no other crew within shouting distance. He'd sent the rest of the team inside an hour ago, the alien girl, and he knew she was alien because nothing that color and nothing that luminescent was from anywhere on the Verith 4 registry was at least 4M below the platform edge and about 6M out from the struts. She had maybe 30 seconds before she went under and didn't come back up. He unclipped his tool belt, clipped his safety line to the emergency ring on the railing, and went over the edge. The water hit him like a wall, cold, far colder than he'd expected for a tropical world, and immediately violent, the surge slamming him against the platform strut and scraping him across the barnacle-covered surface. He kicked hard, got his bearings, and turned toward where he'd seen her go under. She wasn't visible from the surface. He took a breath and dove. Even in the murk he found her. Luminescence helped. She was still faintly glowing beneath the surface, that silver-white light pulsing weakly. And he grabbed her under the arms and drove for the surface with everything he had. She didn't fight him. She was barely conscious, her body limp against his arms, and when they broke the surface she made a sound, not a scream, not a word, something between the two. And then she was coughing, and he was holding onto the platform strut with one hand and holding her up with the other, and trying to remember the emergency retrieval procedure for getting an incapacitated person out of the water when you were alone and the sea wanted to swallow you both. 11 minutes it took. 11 minutes to get her onto the walkway. He had to use the safety line as a pulley, had to time the surges to keep from getting smashed against the platform, and at one point he was completely submerged for what felt like a very long time, but he got her up. He got them both up. He collapsed onto the grating beside her, gasping, soaked through, and looked at the creature he'd just pulled out of the ocean. She was looking back at him. Her eyes were wrong by human standards, too large. Irises the color of deep water, that particular blue-green that lives at 30M, down where the light starts to fade. Pupils were vertical like a cat's, and they were wide and fixed on him with an expression that he couldn't read at all. Not gratitude, not fear, something more complicated than either. She had gill-like structures along her jaw that were flaring open and closed as she breathed, and her fingers, when he checked her wrist out of instinct, looking for injuries, were slightly webbed. She was wearing clothes that were clearly not manufactured anywhere in the Frontier Corps supply chain. Fitted strange fabric, deep blue and silver, embedded with something that pulsed very faintly with light. And GT, laughter. And GT. She was not a registered species. She was not on any colony manifest. She had no business being in the water near Platform 7. She opened her mouth and said something in a language that his translator implant didn't recognize, which meant it wasn't in the Frontier Corps database, which meant she was genuinely from somewhere outside explored space, which meant Marcus Webb had just done something unprecedented. He'd rescued an alien girl from an unknown civilization out of the ocean during a tropical storm. He stared at her, she stared at him. The rain hammered down around them. "You're welcome," he said, because he couldn't think of anything else. She blinked, said something else in that unrecognized language, then slowly, deliberately, she touched 2 fingers to her lips and then pressed them to the back of his hand, a gesture that meant nothing to him culturally but felt somehow formal, intentional, like she was signing something. Marcus Webb didn't know it yet, but that gesture was the oldest form of oath binding in her culture. It meant that she owed him a life debt, and for the Veil, a life debt was not a polite social courtesy. It was absolute, irrevocable, and it came with consequences that were going to reshape everything he thought he knew about his place in the universe. But the storm was still going, and she was still shaking. So first things first, he pulled off his thermal work jacket, wrapped it around her shoulders, and said, "Let's get inside. Now here's where the story gets complicated, and I need you to understand the stakes before we go any further, because what happened next wasn't just about Marcus and one alien girl. It was about a first contact situation that Frontier Corps had been trying to engineer for 11 years and had failed at spectacularly every single time. The Veil were not unknown to the Frontier Corps. They were unknown to the public, unknown to colonists, unknown to everyone below a level 7 clearance. But the upper echelons of the FCC knew they existed. They'd known for a decade. The Veil were a Type 4 civilization, meaning they had developed faster than light travel, had diplomatic relationships with at least 4 other advanced species, and had specifically, deliberately, repeatedly refused to make contact with humanity, not because they thought humans were dangerous, not because they were afraid of us, because they had decided, after observation, that humanity was not ready, that we were too chaotic, too violent, too unpredictable to be brought into the galactic community. 11 years of quiet rejection, 11 years of the FCC sending diplomatic probes and communication packages and carefully worded first contact protocols, and the Veil simply not responding, looking through humanity like we were furniture. The girl in Marcus's jacket was Lyra. He didn't know that yet. He didn't know she was the daughter of the Veil High Counselor, one of the 9 beings who collectively govern the most sophisticated civilization within 200 light years of Earth. He didn't know that she had been on a covert Observation mission to Verith 4. Something the Veil called a witnessing. A rite of passage where young members of the ruling class spent time observing lesser developed cultures without intervention. He didn't know that she'd gotten caught in the storm surge when her cloaking vessel was damaged by the same pressure system that had surprised his weather sensors. He didn't know that her distress beacon had already been received by a Veil retrieval team that was 12 minutes away. He knew she was cold, she was probably in shock, and she needed somewhere warm and dry. He got her to his quarters, a cramped but functional space on platform 7's residential level. He gave her water. She didn't drink it, but she held the cup with both hands and seemed to understand the gesture. He dug out a thermal blanket and wrapped it around her over his jacket. He sat down across from her on the edge of his bunk and said very slowly, "I'm Marcus. Can you understand me?" She tilted her head. The large blue-green eyes tracked him carefully. Then she reached up and touched something behind her ear, a small device he hadn't noticed before, the size of a coin, flat against her skin, and said something, then said it again. Then in slightly accented but entirely comprehensible standard said, "Marcus." He blinked. "You have a translator." "Calibrating," she said. The word came out careful, deliberate, like she was testing the feel of it. "Your language." Simple. He chose not to be offended. "Were you out there alone?" "I was observing," she said, and there was something in her tone, not defensiveness exactly, more like someone who was used to answering to nobody and found the question mildly surprising. The storm was not anticipated. "Yeah," he said, "it wasn't anticipated by any of us." He looked at her. The luminescence had faded a little. She was less actively glowing now, which he took as a good sign, though he had no actual basis for that. "You were going under when I jumped in. If I hadn't been on that walkway." I know," she said simply, directly, no particular emotion attached to it, which somehow made it more significant than if she'd been dramatic about it. She knew, she understood exactly what had happened. "Are you going to tell me who you are?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. The translator was still clearly working because he could see her parsing. Something in her expression shifted in the way that expressions shift when language processing is happening. Then she said, "Lyra, secondary daughter of Counselor Avith, Veil Dominion 5th Spire." A pause. "You do not recognize this uni?" She'd already clocked his blank expression. "Should I?" he said. "Most species we encounter, they would have left me to avoid diplomatic complexity." Marcus stared at her. "You were drowning." She stared back. "Yes, that's not. I wasn't going to leave you because of diplomatic complexity." He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, because to him it was. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have heard that humans are impulsive. Is that what they say about us?" "Among other things." She pulled the thermal blanket tighter. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, not by any human metric, but a softening. "The oath I gave you on the walkway, you do not understand what it means. You touched your fingers to my hand. I bound my life to yours. In my culture, in Veil culture, this is not symbolic. It is law, unbreakable. When I tell my house what happened today, you will not simply be the human who pulled me from the water." She met his eyes. "You will be the human to whom the House of Avith owes everything." Marcus opened his Mouth closed it again. I'm going to. Need a minute, he said. You have 12. She said, my retrieval team will arrive in approximately 12 minutes. When the Vale retrieval team arrived, it was not 12 people in a small shuttle, it was 47 of the most intimidating beings Marcus had ever been in a room with in a vessel that somehow materialized inside Platform 7's hangar bay without triggering a single proximity alarm. They moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that made military special forces look scattered, and every single one of them stopped dead when they saw Marcus was sitting next to Lyra with a cup of coffee and his second best thermal blanket around her shoulders. The team leader, Marcus found out later. Her title translated to something like Senior Guardian, though Warden was. Closer was named Seth, and she looked at Marcus the way you'd look at something that shouldn't exist, not hostile, not threatened, just recalibrating, like every assumption she'd walked in with had just been invalidated by the image in front of her. Lyra spoke first. She addressed Seth in Val fast, formal, clearly high register language, and Marcus's translator couldn't catch most of it. But it lasted about 90 seconds, and by the end, Seth was looking at Marcus with an entirely different expression. Not recalibration anymore, something closer to respect, though still complicated. Then Lyra switched to standard for his benefit. I have told her what happened. I have told her of the oath. A pause. She would like to take you into custody. That's reassuring, Marcus said. I told her no, the not quite smile again. She is not pleased. Seth said something in Val. Lyra responded. There was a back and forth that had the quality of an argument conducted by people who were too professional to raise their voices. Marcus sat there and drank his coffee because there wasn't much else to do. Finally, Lyra turned to him. You will be brought before my house. Before my father, the counselor. Yes. This is not optional. When an oath is given, the receiving party must be presented to the head of house within one cycle, approximately what you would call 3 days, or the oath is considered defiled, and the consequences for my house would be significant. She paused. I apologize for the inconvenience. Is this the part where I'm supposed to be scared? She considered this seriously. Most beings would be. The Val High Council has not invited a human into Val space in recorded history, and I'm going because you touched my hand on a walkway during a storm, and because you jumped into dark water to save someone you had never met, knowing nothing about who they were or what it might cost you. She met his eyes again with those deep blue-green irises. My father will want to know about a person like that. The thing was, Marcus Webb was an engineer on a routine maintenance contract. He had no diplomatic training, no political instincts, no briefing packet on Vale customs, social hierarchies, or the 12 very specific things you were not supposed to do in front of a high counselor unless you wanted to cause an interstellar incident. He was, by every objective measure, the wrong person to be walking into this situation, which is precisely why it went the way it went. They traveled through fold space, the Vale equivalent of FTL transit, and Marcus spent most of it trying not to look as overwhelmed as he was. The ship was extraordinary, not military. Utilitarian, like everything in the Frontier Corps fleet, not the minimalist functional design philosophy he'd seen in Keth and Dravek vessels. Vale ships were built the way a cathedral is built. Like every surface was considered like. The space itself was meant to communicate something about the people who made it, organic geometry, materials that seemed to shift color with the ambient light, structural elements that curved like living things. Lyra found him standing in one of the observation corridors, staring at a viewport that looked out into fold space, which in veiled design wasn't hidden but displayed the strange compressed dimension, luminescence of faster than light, transit rendered in full visibility through what seemed to be a seamless section of hull. He'd been there for 40 minutes. Humans don't usually see fold space directly, she said. Is it dangerous? No. We simply assumed other species would find it disorienting. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, he said honestly. She stood beside him and looked out. We grow up with this view. I had forgotten what it looks like when someone sees it for the first time. Do you make this trip often? Less than I would like. My witnessing was my first unsupervised mission outside Veil space. A beat. It did not go as planned. He looked at her. What were you supposed to be doing on Varath 4? Observing, learning, understanding what it means to live as a lesser. She stopped. As a developing civilization. I apologize. The direct translation is not kind. Lesser civilization, he said. That's what your people call us. She didn't deny it. The classification is technical, not it is not meant as an insult. It describes developmental stage, not value. But you thought we weren't ready. My house has always supported the council's decision to withhold contact. What do you think now? She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the fold space luminescence. The light caught her features differently in here, the silver-white luminescence of her skin responding to it, brightening slightly, and Marcus had noticed that it seemed tied to her emotional state, getting brighter when she was engaged and dimmer when she was carefully neutral. She was brighter now, I think, she said finally, that the council made its judgment based on data, and that data did not include a human jumping into a dark ocean in the middle of a storm to save a stranger. Another pause. We have observed many things about humanity, your wars, your instability, your tendency to destroy what you build. She looked at him directly. We have not observed very much of what you did on that walkway. Empathy, he said, that's a human thing. 2. All species have some form of social cohesion response. Most species will sacrifice for kin, for tribe, for those who share identity markers. She held his gaze. Very few will sacrifice for complete strangers who don't even share their biology. The data on this. For humans it is there if you look, but it is considered an outlier, an anomaly. Maybe someone should have looked harder. He said. That landed. He could tell, because she turned back to the viewport with an expression that was complex in a way his human-trained face reading couldn't fully parse, but whatever it meant, it was significant. Perhaps, she said quietly, perhaps someone should have. The Veil homeworld was called Vathize, and it was the most alien place Marcus Webb had ever set foot on, which was saying something for a man who'd worked on 27 different planetary environments. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't threatening, it was simply other, in the deepest possible sense. A world that had been shaped over thousands of years by a civilization that thought differently, valued differently, built differently. The cities rose in spiraling towers that seemed to grow from the ground rather then be constructed upon it. The sky was a deeper blue than Earth's, with two small moons visible even in daylight. The streets, if you could call them streets, were filled with veil of all ages, and every single one of them stopped moving when they saw Marcus. He was the first human to walk on Vathes. He kept his face neutral and his stride even, and tried very hard to seem like this was a thing he did regularly. Lyra walked beside him. Seth and 12 guardians walked around them in a loose formation that was clearly both on her guard and contingency planning. They moved through the city toward a structure that made the surrounding towers look modest, the high spire home of the council and the noble houses, a building that had been standing for 8,000 years and looked at in the best possible way. Old not as in weathered, but old as in permanent, as in built to outlast everything around it. Counselor Avith was waiting for them in the receiving chamber. He was taller than Marcus had expected. Veil tended toward the slender side of the height spectrum, but Avith had both height and a kind of compressed gravity about him, the quality of someone who had been the most important person in every room he'd ever entered and had simply stopped noticing. He had Lyra's coloring, that silver-white luminescence, and her eyes, though the expression in them when he saw his daughter walk through those doors was something that translated perfectly across every cultural barrier in the universe. That was a father watching his child come home safe. He spoke to her in Vale for a long moment. She responded. He listened. When she was done, he was quiet for several seconds. Then he looked at Marcus. His eyes held that same recalibration quality Seth had shown, but deeper. This was a man who had built his entire world view on a specific model of what humans were, and something about what he was looking at didn't fit. Through Lyra's translation, he said, "You did not know who she was." "No," Marcus said. "You did not know there would be any consequence for your action." "No, you were in danger yourself." "Some," Marcus said honestly. "I had a safety line. But you could not have known what you would find in the water, what was waiting there." "I heard someone drowning," Marcus said. "That was enough." Avith studied him. Then, in standard, smooth and unaccented, the standard of someone who had been studying it for a very long time, he said, "I owe you my daughter's life, Marcus Webb. In Vale law, this is not a debt. It is a bond. You understand the difference?" "I'm starting to. A debt can be paid and discharged. Bond cannot. It can only be honored continuously, without end." He paused. "I have something to offer you, something that has never been offered to a human, and I want you to understand that it is not payment. It is the beginning of an obligation that my house intends to fulfill for as long as there are stars in the sky." Marcus stood very still because he had a feeling deep in the professional instinct part of his brain that had kept him alive through 27 planetary environments and 11 years in the outer frontier core, that what came next was going to be one of those moments, the kind that divided time into before and after. "What is it?" he asked. Avith looked at him steadily. "A seat at the table." "When I say a seat at the table, I don't mean a diplomatic courtesy position. I don't mean honorary membership in some Vale cultural exchange program. I mean a literal seat, a permanent, voting, legally binding seat on the Vale High Council, extended not to Marcus personally, but to humanity as a whole. the first non-Veil species ever offered such a thing. A full partnership in a civilization that had been shaping the destiny of the surrounding 300 light years for millennia. And that was only part of it, the rest of the package, because Avith had clearly been thinking about this since the moment Lyra's transmission reached him in fold space, included open access to Veil technological exchange, including fold space drive specifications that were 140 years ahead of anything human engineers had developed, medical knowledge that could extend human lifespan by an estimated 60 to 80 years, detailed star maps covering regions of space that the Frontier Corps had been trying to chart for 3 decades, and something called the Witnessing Records, 200 years of Veil observation of humanity. Every piece of data they'd collected, unfiltered, offered openly. The reason for that last one was what hit Marcus the hardest. Avith said, "My daughter told me what you said on the ship, that someone should have looked harder." He paused. She was right. Our observers documented human empathy, human sacrifice, human compassion for 200 years, and the Council categorized it as anomalous, as statistically insignificant. We built our model of your civilization on your wars and your failures because they were consistent. We dismissed your kindness because it was complicated, unpredictable, not easily grasped. He looked at Marcus with something that was not quite guilt, but was in that neighborhood. We were wrong. And the reason we were wrong is because we were looking for predictability, and humanity's greatest quality is that it defies prediction. He paused and let that sit in the air of the chamber for a moment. A man jumps into dark water during a storm, he said, for a stranger he has never met. This is not rational, it is not tactical, it is not in your species' evolutionary interest in any measurable way. It is simply good, and goodness that cannot be predicted is the most powerful thing in the universe, Marcus Webb, because you cannot build a defense against it. Chamber was very quiet. My house will honor the oath my daughter gave you, Avith said, but I am also right now in this room asking you as one person to another, as a father to the man who saved his child. What does humanity need? What can we give you that would make the stars better for your people? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He thought about Platform 7 and the constant rain and the smell of salt and rust. He thought about the colonists on Tier 2 worlds working their whole lives with third-generation equipment that was barely adequate. He thought about the Frontier Corps engineers who died every year from conditions that better medicine could have prevented on worlds that better star maps could have helped them reach safely. He thought about 11 years of being told that humanity was getting there, was on the path, was almost ready, while the places that needed help kept needing help in silence. And then Marcus Webb, engineer, Outer Frontier Corps Platform 7, Verith 4, a man with calloused hands and a 2-day beard who had not been briefed on this, who had no authority to speak for his species, who had absolutely no business being in this room, took a breath and said 3 words: help us live, not help us fight, not help us expand, not give us weapons or territory or the power to be dangerous on a galactic scale. Help us live, help our sick and our struggling, and our people on the hard worlds at the edges of known space who are doing the best they can with what they have. The chamber was very quiet for a very long time. Avith looked at him for what felt like a full minute. Lyra, standing slightly to the side, was looking at Marcus with an expression that he still couldn't fully read, but the luminescence was high, brighter than he'd seen it, and in the following weeks and months, as he got to know her better, he'd learned that that brightness meant something specific. It meant she'd seen something that she would not forget. Then Ava's said very quietly, "Yes," and then in a gesture that his aide would later quietly explain was the highest form of acknowledgement in Vale culture, reserved for moments of genuine, profound significance, he crossed his hands over his chest and bent forward in a slow, deliberate bow to Marcus Webb, engineer, 34 years old, 2-day beard, coffee still in hand from that morning on a Vale ship, the first human being ever bowed to by a Vale counselor. The formal contact between humanity and the Vale Dominion was established within 60 days of Marcus's visit to Vathis. The Frontier Corps command structure was, let's say, extremely interested in how a Level 3 maintenance engineer had managed to do in 11 stormy minutes what 11 years of official diplomacy could not. Marcus was offered promotions. He declined all of them. He took a different position, one that was created specifically for him, with a title that took 4 committee meetings to agree on, and which basically translated to the person who talks to the Vale on behalf of humanity informally, which is apparently the only way this works. The Fold space drive specifications went to 3 engineering teams on the same day they were received. Within 8 months, the first human-built Fold space vessel completed a successful trial run. Within 2 years, supply transit times to Tier 2 colony worlds had dropped by 60%. Within 5 years, Frontier Corps medical stations were running Vale biotech, and the statistics on preventable death in the outer colonies dropped by numbers that people who study these things still get a little emotional about. The witnessing records went public 18 months after contact. 200 years of Vale observation of humanity, all of it, and it turned out just as Avith had said, that the record of human empathy, human sacrifice, human warmth towards strangers was right there, documented in careful Vale detail, filed under anomalous behavior, emotional response cascade, category irrational, subcategory unexplained positive deviation, humanity's greatest quality, filed under unexplained, and GT, Snami Nang Sayan, Nalaris sent Marcus a message when the records went public, and GT she'd become in the time since Varath 4 something closer to a friend than anything with a diplomatic title, and her standard had gotten considerably more fluent than calibrating. The message said, "I have been thinking about what you said that someone should have looked harder. I want you to know I am looking. I will keep looking, and I think more of my people will too." He kept that message on the long days, the days when the politics got exhausting and the committees got fractious, and the work of bridging two civilizations felt like it was going to crush him. He'd read it again. Lyra kept looking. Avi's house kept its oath. The stars got a little better for humanity, not because of a government program, not because of a military action, not because of a carefully engineered diplomatic initiative with a 12-year timeline and a 40-page protocol document, because a man on a maintenance walkway heard something in the water and didn't walk away because empathy defies prediction, because that's what humans do. If you want to see more stories about humanity doing the impossible and making the galaxy sit up and pay attention, that's what we're here for every single week. New stories, new worlds, new moments where human beings remind the universe exactly why it should never count us out. Hit subscribe because what comes next is worth staying for. This is HFY. See you out there.